Long before modern nations, before borders were clearly drawn on maps, there was a wall. Not just any wall, but one that stretched across mountains, deserts, and endless landscapes. A structure so vast that it could be seen as a line carved into the earth itself, built over centuries, by generations who would never see its full length. It stood as a symbol of protection, of power, and of human determination. This is the story of the Great Wall of China, the longest structure ever built, and one of the greatest achievements in human history. Welcome to History Before Us. If you enjoy calm historical documentaries and stories from ancient civilizations, don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey now. Let's go back to where it all began. Before the wall, long before the Great Wall stretched across the mountains of China, before stones were stacked and towers were raised, there was no single wall. There were only lands divided, kingdoms separated, and a constant threat that came from beyond the northern borders. To understand the Great Wall, we must first understand the world before it existed. Ancient China was not always one unified empire. For centuries, it was divided into multiple states, each with its own rulers, armies, and ambitions. This period became known as the Warring States period, a time of conflict, of shifting alliances, of endless battles for power. Kingdoms such as Qin, Zhao, Yan, and others competed for control. And while they fought each other, they also faced a different kind of danger. A danger that did not come from within, but from beyond their borders. To the north of these kingdoms lived nomadic tribes, groups of people who moved across vast lands. They did not build cities. They did not stay in one place. Instead, they lived on horseback, traveling across the open plains, hunting, raiding, and surviving in a world very different from that of the settled Chinese states. Among these groups were the Xiongnu, skilled riders, fierce warriors, fast and unpredictable. They could appear suddenly, strike quickly, and disappear before any army could respond. For the kingdoms of northern China, this was a constant problem. Farms were attacked, villages were raided, supplies were stolen, and the border remained unstable. Each kingdom tried to protect itself. Some built small walls, simple barriers made of earth and wood. These early walls were not part of a single system. They were isolated defenses, built by different states for their own protection. They followed natural landscapes, mountains, rivers, hills, places where defense could be stronger. But these walls were not enough. They were limited, disconnected, and often poorly maintained. They slowed down invaders, but they did not stop them. As time passed, the need for stronger defense became clear, but the kingdoms were still divided, still focused on their own survival, until one kingdom began to rise above the others. Qin. Under the leadership of a powerful ruler, the state of Qin grew stronger. Its army became more organized, its strategies more effective, its ambition greater than all the rest. One by one, Qin defeated its rivals, until finally, in 221 BCE, something remarkable happened. For the first time in history, China was unified. The ruler of Qin declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. With this unification came a new vision, a vision of a strong, centralized empire, an empire that could defend itself, control its borders, and maintain order across vast lands. But even with unity, the threat from the north remained. The nomadic tribes had not disappeared. They were still there, still watching, still waiting. And the emperor knew this. He understood that defeating internal enemies was only part of the challenge. To secure his empire, he needed to protect it from external threats. This is where the idea began to change. Instead of separate walls built by different kingdoms, there would be one continuous system, a line of defense that stretched across the northern frontier, a barrier that could protect the entire empire. Qin Shi Huang ordered the connection and expansion of the existing walls. Workers were sent across the land, soldiers, farmers, laborers. Thousands of people were forced to work on this massive project. The goal was simple, but the task was enormous: to build a wall that could defend an empire, across mountains, across deserts, across terrain that was often harsh and unforgiving. This was not just construction. It was a transformation, the beginning of something that would take centuries to complete, something that would become one of the greatest structures ever built. But at this stage, it was only the beginning, a vision, a plan, a decision that would shape the future of China. The Great Wall, as we know it today, did not yet exist, but the idea had been born, and once that idea took form, there was no turning back, because what Qin Shi Huang had started would continue long after his reign. Built by generations, expanded by dynasties, until it became a structure unlike anything the world had ever seen. The First Great Construction. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, he inherited more than a vast empire. He inherited a problem, a constant pressure from the north, raids that could not be predicted, enemies that could not be easily controlled, and a border that remained vulnerable. For the first emperor, this was not something to ignore. It was something to solve, not with small defenses, but with something far greater. His vision was bold: to take the scattered walls built by previous kingdoms and turn them into one continuous system, a single line of defense, a barrier that would stretch across the northern frontier. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the Great Wall of China. But at this stage, it was not the stone structure we imagine today. It was something more raw, more primitive, and incredibly difficult to build. The materials used were simple: packed earth, wood, stone in some regions. Workers would compress layers of soil between wooden frames, creating solid sections of wall. This method, known as rammed earth, was effective and practical. It allowed construction to move quickly across long distances. But even with this method, the scale of the project was overwhelming. The land itself was a challenge. Mountains, deserts, steep hills, remote areas where supplies were difficult to deliver. Everything had to be carried, by hand or by animals. And behind this massive effort was a workforce unlike anything seen before. Hundreds of thousands of people were involved: soldiers, peasants, prisoners, men taken from their homes, forced to work under harsh conditions. For many, this was not a choice. It was an order, a duty imposed by the emperor. And the cost was high. The work was exhausting. The conditions were extreme. Food was limited. Weather was unforgiving. Many workers never returned home. Some died from exhaustion, others from illness, and in some cases, they were buried within the very structure they helped build. Over time, the wall began to take shape, stretching across landscapes that few had ever crossed, following natural lines of defense. Ridges, cliffs, high ground, places where visibility was strong and access was limited. This was not just a wall, it was a system. Watchtowers were placed along its length. From these towers, soldiers could observe the horizon, send signals, communicate over long distances, smoke during the day, fire at night. A message could travel across the wall in moments, warning of approaching danger. This made the wall more than a physical barrier. It became a line of communication, a way to coordinate defense, a network that connected distant parts of the empire. But even with all this effort, the wall was not perfect. It could not stop every invasion. Nomadic tribes could still find ways around it, or attack weaker sections, but that was not its only purpose. The wall slowed movement, forced invaders into predictable paths, gave defenders time to respond, and most importantly, it showed strength. It showed that the empire was not unprotected, that it was organized, that it was prepared. For Qin Shi Huang, this project was about more than defense. It was about control, about unifying the land, not just politically, but physically. A structure that symbolized the power of the empire, a reminder that the land now belonged to one ruler. But the emperor would not see the full future of what he had started. His reign was powerful, but not long. After his death, the Qin dynasty began to weaken. Rebellions rose. The empire faced internal struggles, and eventually, the Qin dynasty fell. But the wall did not disappear. Parts of it remained. Standing across the land, a foundation built under one dynasty that would be continued by others, because the need for defense had not ended. The threats from the north were still there, and the idea of the wall was too important to abandon. Over the centuries that followed, new dynasties would take control, each one adding to the wall, expanding it, rebuilding it, strengthening it. What began as a project of one emperor would become the work of many generations, and with each addition, the wall would grow, not just in length, but in significance, because it was no longer just a defense. It was becoming something else, a symbol, a mark of human effort, a structure that reflected the determination of those who built it, and the power of those who commanded it. But the story of the wall was far from complete, because its greatest transformation was still yet to come. Dynasties and expansion. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, the empire did not collapse completely. A new power rose to take its place. The Han Dynasty, and with it, a new chapter in the story of the wall began. The early sections built under Qin Shi Huang remained, but they were not enough. The northern threat had not disappeared. The Xiongnu were still there, still moving across the vast steppe, still capable of launching fast and unexpected attacks. For the Han rulers, the problem was the same. How do you protect an empire from an enemy that does not stay in one place? At first, they tried diplomacy, peace agreements, trade exchanges, even marriages between royal families. But these solutions did not always work. Conflict returned, raids continued, and once again, the need for stronger defense became clear. So the Han Dynasty made a decision, not just to maintain the wall, but to expand it. Further west, further into the frontier, they pushed the wall beyond its earlier limits, stretching it across deserts and into regions that connected China with Central Asia. This was not only about defense, it was also about control. Because during the Han Dynasty, something important was developing, a network of trade routes that would later be known as the Silk Road. This route connected China to distant regions, carrying goods, ideas, and cultures across continents. Silk, spices, metals, and knowledge moved along these paths. And with such valuable trade came the need for protection. The wall now served a second purpose, not just to defend against invasions, but to protect trade, to secure movement, to ensure that the flow of goods could continue safely. Watchtowers along the wall became checkpoints, places where soldiers could monitor activity, control access, and respond to threats. In some areas, forts were built, larger structures that housed troops and supplies, creating a stronger defensive network. The wall was no longer a simple barrier. It had become a system, a combination of walls, towers, forts, and roads, all working together, all connected. But building in these regions was even more difficult than before. The land was harsher, the distances longer. Deserts stretched for miles. Water was scarce. And yet, construction continued. Workers adapted, using materials available in each region. In deserts, they used layers of sand and reeds. In rocky areas, they used stone. The design of the wall changed depending on the environment, but the purpose remained the same: to create a line of defense, a presence that could be seen and felt. The Han Dynasty also improved communication along the wall. Signal systems became more advanced. Smoke signals during the day, fire at night, drums and flags in certain areas. Messages could travel quickly across long distances, allowing the army to respond faster than ever before. This gave the empire a new advantage: awareness, the ability to know when danger was approaching, and to prepare before it arrived. But even with these improvements, the wall was not a perfect solution. The Xiongnu adapted. They found ways around it. They avoided strong points, targeted weaker areas, and continued to challenge the empire. This showed an important truth. The wall was not meant to make the empire invincible. It was meant to make it stronger, to reduce risk, to manage threats, to create order along a difficult frontier. And in that, it succeeded. The northern border became more controlled, trade routes became safer, and the empire gained greater stability. For centuries, the Han Dynasty maintained and expanded the wall. But like all dynasties, it eventually came to an end. New rulers took power. New priorities emerged. And for a time, the wall was no longer the focus. In later periods, some sections fell into neglect. Others were damaged by time and nature. The structure that had once been carefully maintained began to weaken. But the idea of the wall never disappeared, because the need it represented was still there. The challenge of defending a vast empire, the desire to control borders, the need to protect what lies within. And as new dynasties rose, that idea would return, stronger, more advanced, more ambitious than ever before. Because the wall was not just a project of one era. It was something that would be built, rebuilt, and reimagined again and again, until it became what we recognize today: The Ming Wall: stone, strength, and strategy. By the time the Ming Dynasty rose to power in the late 14th century, the world around China had changed once again. Previous dynasties had built, extended, and sometimes neglected the wall. Sections had weakened. Some had disappeared into the landscape. Others stood, but no longer served their purpose. And from the north, a familiar threat had returned: the Mongols, descendants of the same nomadic traditions that had challenged China for centuries. But these were not small raiding groups. They had once ruled China itself under the Yuan dynasty. They understood the land, the defenses, the weaknesses, and even after being pushed out by the Ming, they remained powerful, still capable of attack, still watching the borders. For the Ming rulers, this was not a problem that could be ignored. They had seen what happened when control was lost. They had learned from the past, and this time, they chose a different approach. Instead of relying on scattered defenses, they would build something stronger, more permanent, more advanced. This was the moment when the Great Wall began to take the form we recognize today. The Ming Dynasty did not simply repair the old walls, they rebuilt them, using new materials, new techniques, and a clearer vision. Stone replaced earth in many areas. Bricks were used for greater durability. The walls became higher, thicker, stronger. In some places, the wall reached heights of over 7 to 8 meters, wide enough at the top for soldiers and even horses to move along it. This was no longer a simple barrier. It was a military system, stretching across thousands of kilometers, designed not just to slow down enemies, but to control them. Watchtowers were built at regular intervals. From these towers, soldiers could observe vast distances. The high ground provided a clear view of approaching threats. But these towers had another purpose: communication. Signals could be sent quickly across the wall. Smoke during the day, fire at night. One tower would light a signal. The next would respond. And within minutes, information could travel across long distances. This allowed the Ming army to react faster than ever before, to move troops where they were needed, to prepare before the enemy arrived. Fortresses were also constructed along key points, larger structures that could hold soldiers, weapons, and supplies. These were not temporary outposts. They were permanent military bases, integrated into the wall itself, creating a network of defense. The Ming also paid close attention to geography. The wall was not built randomly. It followed the natural landscape: mountains, ridges, cliffs, places where the land itself provided an advantage. In many areas, the wall became part of the mountain, rising and falling with the terrain, blending into the environment while strengthening it. This made it harder for enemies to approach, harder to attack, harder to break through. But building such a structure was not easy. The scale was enormous. The distances were vast, and the conditions were often harsh. Thousands of workers were involved: soldiers, laborers, prisoners, people from across the empire. They carried materials across mountains, worked in extreme heat and freezing cold, and faced dangers every day. The construction of the Ming Wall was one of the largest building efforts in human history, and like before, the cost was high. Many lives were lost. Many never returned home. But the wall continued to grow, section by section, stone by stone, until it stretched across the northern frontier like a line drawn across the land, a line that could be seen, a line that could be defended, a line that represented power. But even with all its strength, the wall was not perfect. No wall ever is. Enemies could still find ways through gaps, through betrayal, through strategy. Because in the end, defense is not only about walls, it is about people, leadership, decisions. And sometimes, those decisions fail. Despite the strength of the Great Wall, the Ming Dynasty would eventually face invasion, not by breaking the wall directly, but by going around it and through it. In 1644, the Ming Dynasty fell, and a new power rose. The Qin Dynasty, a dynasty that came from beyond the wall. This moment revealed something important. The wall was powerful, but it was not absolute. It could protect, it could delay, it could defend, but it could not decide the future on its own. And yet, its importance remained, because even as dynasties changed, the wall continued to stand, a structure built across centuries, shaped by different rulers, different needs, different visions. And through all those changes, it became something more than a defense. It became a symbol of effort, of ambition, of the human ability to build something lasting. But its story was not finished, because what the wall represented would continue to evolve. From a military structure to something far greater, life along the wall. By the time the Ming Dynasty had rebuilt and strengthened the Great Wall, it was no longer just a line on the map. It was a place, a world of its own, stretching across mountains, deserts, and valleys. The wall was alive with movement, with people, with purpose. For those who lived along it, the Great Wall was not a symbol. It was part of daily life. Along its vast length stood thousands of watchtowers. From a distance they appeared silent, still, but inside there was constant activity. Soldiers kept watch day and night, scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, any sign of danger. The work was repetitive, often quiet, but always important, because a single moment of inattention could lead to disaster. The soldiers stationed on the wall came from different parts of the empire. Some were trained warriors, others were conscripts, men sent to serve far from home. For many, life on the wall was difficult. The conditions were harsh. In the mountains, the cold was intense. Winds cut through the air. Snow covered the ground for months. In the desert regions, the heat was relentless. Water was scarce. The land offered little comfort. Isolation was another challenge. Many soldiers spent long periods away from their families, weeks, months, sometimes years. Their world became the wall, the towers, the small communities that formed around them. But they were not alone. Along the wall, entire settlements developed, villages where families lived, farmers who worked the land nearby, craftsmen who supported the needs of the garrisons, blacksmiths repaired weapons, builders maintained the structure. Supplies were transported along the wall, food, equipment. Everything needed to keep the system functioning. The wall was not just a defense, it was part of a network, a system that required constant support. In some areas, the top of the wall was wide enough for soldiers to walk side by side, or even ride horses. Paths connected towers to fortresses, allowing movement across long distances. This made the wall more than a barrier. It became a road, a line of communication, a way to move quickly across difficult terrain. At night, the wall took on a different atmosphere. Torches lit the towers. Fires burned against the darkness. The silence of the landscape was broken only by the wind, or the distant sounds of guards on patrol. And always, there was the sense of waiting for something to appear on the horizon, waiting for a signal, waiting for the moment when calm would turn into action. When danger approached, the system came alive. Smoke signals during the day, fire at night, messages passed from tower to tower, the entire line responding as one. Troops prepared, defenses activated. The wall became a living structure, reacting, adapting, defending. But not every day was marked by conflict. There were long periods of peace. Times when the wall stood quiet, when trade moved nearby, when travelers passed through controlled gates, because the wall did not only separate. In some places, it connected. Trade routes crossed its path. Merchants traveled between regions, exchanging goods, ideas, and culture. The wall became a point of control, a place where movement could be monitored, not just stopped, but managed. This dual role made the wall unique. It was both a barrier and a gateway. But despite all this activity, life along the wall was never easy. Supplies could run low. Weather could change suddenly. Communication, though improved, was not perfect. And the threat from beyond the wall never fully disappeared. For the people who lived there, the wall was a constant presence, a reminder of both safety and danger. It protected them, but it also defined their world. And yet, over time, something deeper began to form, a connection between people and the structure itself. The wall was no longer just something built by the empire. It became something experienced, something lived, something that shaped the lives of those around it. Stories were told of soldiers who stood watch for years, of families who grew up in its shadow, of moments of fear and moments of quiet. These stories became part of the wall's identity because every stone, every tower, every path held a memory, a trace of those who had been there. And in that way, the Great Wall became more than a physical structure. It became a human one, a place where history was not only written, but lived. And as time moved forward, those lives, those experiences, would become part of something even greater. Because the wall was no longer just about defense. It was becoming a symbol, a reflection of what people had built together and what they had endured. But that transformation was still unfolding. Beyond defense, trade, power, and connection. For centuries, the Great Wall was seen as a line of defense, a barrier meant to keep danger out and protect what lay within. But over time, its role began to change. Because a structure built across such vast lands could not remain only a wall. It became something more. A system that shaped movement, controlled access, and influenced the flow of the world around it. Beyond the northern frontier, life continued. Nomadic tribes still moved across the steppe, trading, migrating, and surviving in their own way. And despite the wall, interaction between these worlds never fully stopped. Instead, it evolved. Along certain sections of the wall, gates were established. Large openings, heavily guarded, points where movement could be controlled. not just blocked, but allowed. These gates became places of exchange. Merchants arrived from distant regions, carrying goods from across Central Asia and beyond: silk, spices, fur, precious metals, items that traveled across long distances. And at these gates, they met traders from within China. The wall, once a symbol of separation, became a point of connection, a place where two different worlds met. But this exchange was not simple. It was carefully managed. Officials monitored who entered and who left. Goods were inspected. Trade was regulated, because the same routes that allowed commerce could also allow danger. The balance between openness and control became essential. This balance defined the role of the wall during later periods. It was no longer just about stopping invasions. It was about managing relationships between settled empires and mobile societies, between stability and movement. In some cases, agreements were made between Chinese rulers and northern tribes, trade treaties, peace arrangements, systems that allowed goods to move while reducing conflict. The wall played a central role in these agreements. It marked the boundary, the line where negotiation happened. But even as trade increased, the presence of the wall remained important, because trust was never complete. Tensions still existed, conflicts could still arise, and the need for defense never fully disappeared. This dual role made the wall unique. It was both a protector and a mediator, a structure that controlled not only land, but relationships. At the same time, the wall also strengthened the internal power of the empire. It allowed rulers to define clear borders, to organize military presence, to project authority across distant regions. In areas far from the capital, the wall acted as a symbol, a reminder that the empire extended even to these remote lands, that it had reach, that it had structure, and that it could defend itself. This presence helped maintain order. It gave confidence to those living near the frontier: farmers, traders, communities that depended on stability. But maintaining such a system required constant effort. The wall had to be repaired. Towers had to be manned. Supplies had to be delivered. The network had to remain active, because once neglected, it could quickly lose its effectiveness. And over time, as dynasties rose and fell, this maintenance was not always consistent. Some rulers invested heavily in the wall. Others focused on different priorities, leading to cycles of strength and decline. Sections would be rebuilt. Others would fall into disrepair. Nature itself began to shape parts of the structure: wind, rain, time, all leaving their mark. Yet even in these moments of decline, the idea of the wall remained, because it represented something essential: the need to protect, the need to define, the need to manage the space between different worlds. And as centuries passed, the significance of the wall continued to grow, not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of something larger, a symbol of effort, of persistence, of the human ability to build across generations. Because the Great Wall was never the work of one moment. It was the result of centuries of decisions, of labor, of vision. Each dynasty adding something, each generation leaving its mark. And through all those changes, it remained, stretching across the land, connecting past to present, a structure that reflected both the challenges and the achievements of those who built it. But its story was still evolving, because as time moved forward, the meaning of the wall would change once again, from a structure of power to a symbol of identity, and eventually to something recognized far beyond the borders it once defined, a symbol beyond stone. By the time the Great Wall had been built, rebuilt, and expanded across centuries, it was no longer just a structure. It had become a symbol. At first, the wall was about survival, a response to danger, a way to defend the empire from threats beyond its borders. But over time, its meaning grew. It began to represent something deeper, something that went beyond war and beyond strategy. For the people of China, the wall became a reflection of strength, a visible line across the land that showed what could be achieved through unity, through effort, through generations working toward a single goal. Because the Great Wall was not built in a day, or even in a single lifetime. It was built over centuries, by different dynasties, different rulers, different people, each adding something, each continuing what came before. And in that, it became more than a project. It became a shared achievement, a part of identity. But symbols are not only created by those who build them. They are also shaped by those who see them. For travelers, traders, and visitors from distant lands, the wall was something extraordinary, a structure that stretched further than the eye could see, climbing mountains, crossing valleys, following the natural lines of the earth. To many, it seemed impossible, a creation that defied expectation. Stories about the wall began to spread, across regions, across cultures. Some described it as endless, others as unbreakable. Some even believed it could be seen from the sky. Over time, these stories became part of its legend. The wall was no longer just a structure in China. It became known to the world, a symbol of scale, of ambition, of human capability. But within China itself, its meaning continued to evolve. As the centuries passed, the need for constant military defense began to decrease. New technologies emerged. New strategies replaced old ones. The world changed. And the wall, once essential for protection, became less central to warfare. Some sections were no longer actively used. Others were maintained more as tradition than necessity. But this did not reduce its importance. Instead, it transformed. The wall became a link to the past, a reminder of what had been built, of what had been endured, of the challenges that had shaped the nation. For scholars and historians, it became a subject of study, a way to understand the decisions of past dynasties, the strategies of defense, the organization of labor, the movement of people. For artists and poets, it became a source of inspiration, a symbol of perseverance, of distance, of time. They wrote about its length, its presence, its connection to the land. They saw in it not just stone and brick, but meaning. And for ordinary people, it became something familiar, something that had always been there, a part of the landscape, a part of their story. Even if they never walked its full length, they knew it existed. They knew what it represented, and that knowledge became part of cultural identity. But the transformation of the wall did not stop there. As the world became more connected, the Great Wall began to take on a new role. It became a place people wanted to see, to visit, to experience. Travelers came from far away, walking along its paths, climbing its steps, looking out across the land it once protected. They saw not just a wall, but a piece of history, something that had survived time, something that connected them to the past. And in that moment, the wall became something else again, a bridge between past and present, between those who built it and those who now stand upon it. Because standing on the wall is not just about seeing a structure. It is about understanding what it represents, the effort of thousands, the vision of rulers, the endurance of generations, all coming together in one continuous line, stretching across the land, stretching across time. And yet, even as it stands strong today, the wall is not unchanged. Time continues to shape it. Weather, erosion, human activity, all leave their mark. Some sections have been restored. Others remain as ruins, fragments of what once was. But even in those fragments, the meaning remains. Because the Great Wall is not defined by its condition. It is defined by its existence, by the fact that it was built, that it endured, that it continues to stand. And that is what gives it its power, not just as a structure, but as a symbol that continues to evolve, that continues to represent something different to each generation. And as we move forward, its story continues, not as a defense, but as a reminder of what has been achieved and of what is possible. But even now, there's more to its story, because what we see today is only part of what the wall has been, and part of what it will become, the wall in a changing world. As centuries passed, the Great Wall did not disappear, but the world around it changed. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, new ideas reshaped how nations protected themselves, and slowly, the role of the wall began to fade. By the time of the Qin Dynasty, which came to power in the 17th century, China was ruled by a people who had once lived beyond the wall, the Manchus. They had crossed into China, not by breaking the wall, but by moving through its defenses, by using strategy, alliances, and opportunity. This moment revealed something important. The wall, no matter how strong, was not enough on its own, because protection is not only about structures, it is about decisions, about unity, about leadership. And when those elements shift, even the strongest defenses can be overcome. Under the Qing Dynasty, the focus of power moved. The threat from the north was no longer the same. The empire expanded beyond the wall, into regions that had once been considered outside its control. The wall was no longer the edge. It was inside the empire. And with that, its purpose changed again. It was no longer a frontline defense. It became a reminder, a structure built for a world that had already moved forward. Some sections of the wall were maintained. Others were left to time. Wind, rain, and nature slowly began to reshape parts of it. Bricks loosened, stone eroded. Entire sections faded into the landscape. But even as it aged, the wall remained visible, a line across the land, a presence that could not be ignored. Travelers who passed near it saw something remarkable, not just its size, but its endurance, because the Great Wall had outlived the reasons it was built. It stood beyond its original purpose, and in doing so, it gained a new kind of meaning. During later centuries, especially as China interacted more with the outside world, the wall became known beyond its borders. Explorers, writers, visitors from distant lands, they spoke of it, described it, shared its image with the world, and gradually, the Great Wall became something global. Not just a Chinese structure, but a human one. A symbol recognized across cultures, representing effort, scale, determination. In the modern era, this transformation became even clearer. The wall was no longer seen as a military system. It became a place of history, a place of reflection, a place where people could connect with the past. Sections of the wall were restored, paths were rebuilt, access was improved so that people could walk along it, experience it, see it not just from a distance, but from within. Millions of visitors now come each year, climbing its steps, looking out across the landscapes it once defended, standing where soldiers once stood, following the same paths, but in a different time. And in those moments, the wall becomes something personal. Each person sees it in their own way. Some see history, some see achievement, some see the effort of generations, and others simply see something vast, something that feels almost impossible to fully understand. Because no matter how much we study it, the scale of the Great Wall remains difficult to grasp. It stretches across thousands of kilometers, across mountains, deserts, and valleys, built over centuries by countless hands, each section telling part of a larger story, a story that cannot be seen all at once, but must be experienced, piece by piece. And perhaps that is what makes it so unique. The Great Wall is not just one structure. It is many structures, built at different times, for different reasons, by different people. And yet, it is understood as one, a single idea, a single vision, carried across generations, and even now, that vision continues. Not through construction, but through meaning. Because the wall no longer defines a border. It defines a story of effort, of challenge, of human ambition. And as time continues to move forward, that story does not end, it changes. Just as the wall itself has changed, from defense to symbol, to history, and now to something that belongs to the world. But even with all these changes, one question remains. What does the Great Wall truly represent? Is it a symbol of protection, of separation, of unity, or something else entirely? The answer may lie not only in the past, but in how we choose to understand it today. The meaning behind the wall. By the time the Great Wall had passed through centuries of change, it was no longer defined by a single purpose. It had been a defense, a boundary, a system of control, a place of life. And now, it stood as something more difficult to define. Because the Great Wall is not just a structure, it is an idea shaped by the people who built it, the rulers who commanded it, and the generations who came after. To some, the wall represents protection, a line drawn across the land to keep danger out, a symbol of safety, of strength, of the need to defend what lies within. For centuries, it stood between two worlds, the settled empire and the open steppe, the known and the unknown. And in that position, it became a guardian, a presence that watched over the land. But to others, the wall represents something different. Not protection, but separation. A line that divides. That defines who belongs and who does not. A boundary that separates cultures, ways of life, perspectives. For the people beyond the wall, it may have felt like exclusion, a reminder that they were seen as outsiders, different, unwelcome. This dual meaning gives the wall a deeper complexity because it is both a symbol of unity and division. It brings people together while also keeping them apart. And perhaps that is why it continues to be studied, not just as a physical structure, but as a reflection of human thinking. Because throughout history, people have built walls, not only in China, but in many parts of the world, to protect, to define, to control. And each of those walls carries its own meaning. But the Great Wall stands apart because of its scale, its history, its continuity. It was not built in a single moment. It was built over centuries, each generation adding to it, each era shaping it in a different way, and in that, it became something that belongs to no single time. It connects the past to the present and invites questions about the future. What does it mean to protect a nation? What does it mean to define a border? What does it mean to separate or to connect? These questions are not limited to history. They are still relevant today because even now, the world continues to deal with these ideas. Nations define boundaries. Societies create divisions. People decide what to protect and what to share. The Great Wall becomes a way to think about these choices. A reminder that every structure, every decision, has meaning beyond its immediate purpose. But there is another layer to its story, a more human one. Because behind the idea, there were people, thousands, hundreds of thousands, who worked on the wall, who lived near it, who depended on it, who suffered because of it. For them, the wall was not an abstract concept. It was real. It was labor. It was daily life. It was survival. Some saw it as protection. Others saw it as burden. And many experienced both. Their voices are not always recorded. Their stories are not always told. But they are part of the wall, part of its foundation, part of its meaning, because every stone was placed by someone. Every tower built by hands that endured the conditions of their time. And that human effort gives the wall a different kind of importance, not just as a symbol of power, but as a symbol of endurance, of what people are capable of when they are driven by necessity, or commanded by authority, or inspired by vision. The Great Wall is often described as one of the greatest achievements in human history, and in many ways, it is. But it is also a reminder of the complexity of history, of the fact that great achievements often come with great cost, and that understanding the past means looking at both, the achievement and the experience behind it. Today, the wall stands as a place people can visit, walk along, observe, reflect. But it is also a place that invites thought, not just about what was built, but about why it was built and what it continues to represent. Because the meaning of the Great Wall is not fixed. It changes with perspective, with time, with understanding, and perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. It is not only a structure to be seen, but a story to be considered. A question that remains open, waiting to be answered in different ways by each generation that comes after. a structure that outlived its time. By the time the Great Wall had passed through dynasties, wars, and centuries of change, it had already achieved something rare. It had outlived its original purpose. What began as a line of defense, a response to immediate threats, had become something that no longer depended on those threats to exist. Because the world that created the wall no longer existed in the same way. The enemies it was built to stop had changed. The strategies of warfare had evolved. The idea of defending a nation through a continuous physical barrier was no longer enough. And yet, the wall remained, standing across the land, unaffected by the disappearance of the world that had demanded its creation. This is what makes the Great Wall different. It is not only a structure tied to its time, it is a structure that moved beyond its time. For many historical constructions, their importance fades when their purpose ends. Fortresses become ruins. Defensive systems are abandoned. Their meaning becomes limited to the past. But the Great Wall did not follow that path. Instead, it changed its role. It became something else, a witness, a silent observer of everything that came after. It saw the rise of new dynasties, the expansion of borders, the transformation of society. It stood through moments of stability and moments of collapse, through peace and through conflict, through change that reshaped the world around it. And through all of that, it remained, not unchanged, but still present, still visible, still part of the landscape. This presence gives the wall a unique position in history. It connects different eras, different moments, different ways of understanding the world. Because when someone stands on the wall today, they are not standing in a single time. They are standing across many times at once. Each layer of stone, each section of the structure, belongs to a different moment in history, a different decision, a different need, and all of those moments exist together in one continuous line. This creates something rare, a structure that is not only historical, but multi-layered, a place where the past is not distant, but present. But there is also another aspect to this, something that is often overlooked. The wall did not survive simply because it was built. It survived because it was remembered, because people continued to see its value, not just as a defense, but as a part of identity, as something worth preserving. This shift from function to meaning is what allowed the wall to endure. Because when a structure becomes part of how people understand themselves, it no longer depends on its original purpose. It becomes something that carries forward, across generations, across changes in society, across shifts in power. And this is exactly what happened with the Great Wall. It became part of cultural memory, part of national identity, part of how history is told. But even with this importance, the wall is not immune to time. Sections have been lost, others damaged, some restored. The wall we see today is not exactly the wall that once existed. It is a combination of what remains and what has been rebuilt. This raises an important question. What does it mean to preserve history? Is it about maintaining what is original, or about maintaining what is meaningful? The Great Wall exists somewhere between these ideas. It is both ancient and renewed, both original and restored, and this balance allows it to continue, to remain part of the present, while still belonging to the past. But perhaps the most important aspect of the wall is not what it was built for, or even what it has become. It is what it represents: the ability of people to create something that lasts, to build across generations, to contribute to something they may never fully see completed. Because no single person built the Great Wall, no single ruler finished it. It is the result of collective effort, of thousands working toward a shared goal. And that idea extends beyond the wall itself. It reflects something about human history, that the most lasting achievements are rarely the work of one moment. They are built over time, through persistence, through continuation, through the willingness to keep building, even when the end is not visible. The Great Wall stands as an example of that process, a structure that began with necessity, continued through ambition, and survived through meaning. And even now, it continues to exist. Not as it once was, but as something shaped by time, something that continues to evolve, just as the world around it does. And in that, its story is not finished, because a structure that has already outlived its time can continue to outlive many more. Walking the wall. Today, the Great Wall is no longer a place of war. No soldiers stand guard along its towers. No signals of fire move across its peaks. The threats it was built to face belong to another time. And yet, the wall remains, stretching across the land, just as it did centuries ago. But the experience of the wall has changed, because now, people do not come to defend it. They come to walk it. From different parts of the world, millions of visitors arrive each year. They travel across cities and landscapes until they reach it, and for a moment, they stand before something that feels almost unreal, a structure that does not fit easily into modern life. Something too large, too old, too continuous, to fully understand at once. Some sections of the wall have been carefully restored, places like Badaling and Mutianyu. Here, the stones are strong, the steps are clear, the paths are accessible. Visitors can walk along the wall, climb its towers, and look out across the surrounding mountains. These areas are designed to be experienced, to be seen, to be understood. But even in these restored sections, there is a sense of history, a feeling that this place is not new, but preserved, that what you are walking on has existed long before you arrived, and will remain long after you leave. Other parts of the wall are very different, unrestored, broken, fading into the landscape. In these places, the wall feels quieter, more distant, closer to what it once was. The stones are uneven. The path is difficult. Nature has begun to take over. Grass grows between the cracks. Sections collapse into the earth, and here, the wall feels less like a monument and more like a memory. These contrasts show something important. The Great Wall is not one single experience. It is many. Each section tells a different part of the story. Each location reflects a different moment in time. And depending on where you stand, the wall feels different. For some, it is a place of achievement, a structure that represents human strength and effort. For others, it is a place of reflection, a reminder of history and the passage of time. Some walk the wall for the view, looking out across mountains and valleys, seeing the landscape from a perspective that few structures can offer. Others walk it for the meaning, to connect with something older, something that carries the weight of centuries. And in that moment, the wall becomes personal. Because standing on the Great Wall is not just about seeing it. It is about experiencing it, feeling the distance, the scale, the effort it took to build it. Each step carries a sense of time, a reminder that this path was once walked by others. Soldiers, workers, messengers, people who lived in a completely different world, yet stood in the same place. And this creates a connection, not through words, but through presence. Because even without knowing every detail of its history, you can feel that it matters, that it represents something beyond itself. But this modern experience also brings new challenges. Tourism has increased. Foot traffic has worn down some sections. The need to preserve the wall has become more urgent. Restoration efforts continue, carefully balancing between protecting the structure and maintaining its authenticity. Because preserving history is not always simple. Every repair changes something. Every restoration adds something new. And the question remains, how do you protect something ancient without losing what makes it original? The Great Wall exists in that balance, between past and present, between preservation and change. And that balance is part of its ongoing story. Because the wall is not frozen in time. It continues to evolve, just in a different way, through how people interact with it, how they understand it, how they choose to preserve it. And in that sense, the wall is still being shaped. Not by builders with stone and brick, but by those who walk it, who study it, who decide what it means. Because history is not only what was created, it is what is remembered, what is valued, what is carried forward. And the Great Wall continues to be carried forward, step by step, visitor by visitor, moment by moment. And as long as people continue to walk along it, its story continues, not just as something that was built, but as something that is still experienced. The future of the wall. The Great Wall of China has already lived many lives. It has been a defense, a boundary, a network, a symbol, and now it stands as a bridge between the past and its present. But even something as vast and enduring as the Great Wall is not beyond time. Because like everything built by human hands, it continues to change. The question is no longer only about what the wall was, but about what it will become. Today, the Great Wall faces a different kind of challenge. Not invasion, not war, but preservation. Across its thousands of kilometers, many sections remain strong, carefully restored, protected, maintained so that future generations can experience them. But other parts are more fragile, exposed to wind, rain, and erosion, slowly wearing away, stone by stone. In remote areas, entire sections have begun to disappear, blending back into the landscape from which they were built. In some places, only traces remain. A line of earth, a broken foundation, a memory of what once stood there. This natural process raises an important question. Should every part of the wall be restored? Or should some parts be allowed to return to the land? Because preservation is not always about rebuilding everything. Sometimes, it is about choosing what to protect and how to protect it. Modern efforts focus on finding that balance, using technology, research, careful planning to maintain the wall without losing its historical integrity. Drones map its length. Archaeologists study its construction. Engineers develop methods to strengthen it without changing its original character. This is a different kind of work. Not building, but protecting. And it reflects a shift in how we see history. The Great Wall is no longer something to expand. It is something to understand, to preserve, to respect. But preservation is not only a technical challenge, it is also a human one, because the wall exists within a modern world, near cities, near communities, in areas where people live and work. Some sections have been affected by development, others by tourism. The need to balance access with protection is constant, allowing people to experience the wall while ensuring it is not damaged. This requires awareness, responsibility, and a shared understanding of its value, because the Great Wall does not belong to one generation. It belongs to all, past, present, and future. It carries the work of those who built it, and the responsibility of those who preserve it. And in that, it becomes something more than history. It becomes a commitment to remember, to protect, to continue the story, without losing what makes it meaningful. But beyond preservation, there is another future for the wall, one that exists in how it is understood, how it is taught, how it is shared. The Great Wall is studied around the world, in schools, in books, in documentaries. It is used as an example of human achievement, of long-term effort, of the ability to build something that lasts. But it is also used to ask questions about power, about borders, about the choices that shape societies. And in that way, its future is not only physical, it is intellectual. It continues to influence how people think, how they understand history, how they connect the past to the present. Because every time someone learns about the Great Wall, its story continues, not through construction, but through knowledge, through reflection, through curiosity. And perhaps that is the most important part of its future, that it continues to inspire, to raise questions, to connect people with something larger than themselves. Because even as time moves forward, the wall remains, not exactly as it was, but still present, still meaningful, still part of the world. And as long as it stands, in stone or in memory, its story will not end. It will continue, in different forms, through different perspectives, across different generations, because the Great Wall is not just something that was built, it is something that continues to exist. And what it becomes will depend on those who come after, on how they choose to see it, to protect it, and to carry its story forward. And that story is still being written. What the wall teaches us. After centuries of construction, after dynasties, wars, and transformation, the Great Wall stands not only as a structure, but as a lesson written in stone. Because when we look at the wall today, we are not only seeing what was built, we are seeing what it means. The Great Wall teaches us about time. Not time as a moment, but time as a process. It reminds us that some things are not created quickly. They are built slowly, over years, over generations, sometimes by people who will never see the final result. And yet, they continue, because they believe in something larger than themselves. The wall exists because of that belief, because of the willingness to contribute, even without seeing the end. And that idea still matters. Because in every era, there are things that require patience, effort that extends beyond a single lifetime. The Great Wall shows us that such effort can endure, but it also teaches us about limits. Because even something as massive as the wall had boundaries. It could not stop every invasion. It could not control every outcome. It could not guarantee safety. And this reminds us of something important, that no structure, no system is absolute. That strength has limits, that protection has conditions, and that understanding those limits is part of wisdom. The wall also teaches us about adaptation. It was not built once. It was built many times, changed, expanded, reimagined. Each dynasty saw it differently. Each era used it in its own way. And that ability to adapt is what allowed it to survive. If it had remained fixed, unchanged, it would have disappeared. But because it evolved, it endured. This is another lesson. That survival is not only about strength, it is about change. The willingness to adjust, to respond, to continue in a new form. And the Great Wall reflects that process. It is both old and renewed, both original and transformed. It carries its past, while still existing in the present. There is also a lesson in connection. At first, the wall seems like a line of separation, a boundary between two worlds. But over time, it became something that connected. Trade routes passed through its gates. Ideas moved along its length. People interacted across its presence. And in that, it became part of a larger network. A system that linked different regions, different cultures, different ways of life. This shows that even structures built to divide can also connect. That boundaries are not always absolute. They can be places of exchange, of interaction, of understanding. And this idea continues to be relevant because even today, the world is shaped by borders, by divisions, by decisions about where one thing ends and another begins. The Great Wall offers a way to think about these ideas, not as fixed answers, but as ongoing questions. What should be protected? What should be shared? Where should lines be drawn? And how should they be understood? These questions do not belong only to history. They belong to the present and to the future. But perhaps the most important lesson is about people. Because behind the wall, there were individuals, workers who carried materials across mountains, soldiers who stood watch through long nights, families who lived near its path, each with their own experiences, their own challenges, their own stories. The wall was not built by an idea alone. It was built by human effort, and that effort gives it meaning. Because when we look at the wall, we are not only seeing stone, we are seeing the result of thousands of lives, connected through a shared purpose. And that is what makes it powerful. Not just what it is, but what it represents. A collective achievement. A structure that exists because many people contributed to it. And that idea extends beyond the wall itself. It reflects something about how history is created, that the most significant changes are often the result of many small actions, combined, continued, carried forward. The Great Wall teaches us that history is not only shaped by rulers or by decisions made at the top. It is also shaped by those who build, who support, who participate, and who endure. And as we look at it today, we can see all those layers, all those contributions, all those moments together, forming something that continues to exist, not just as a structure, but as a reminder of what people can create, of what they can sustain, and of what they can leave behind. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all, that what we build can outlast us if it is carried forward, if it is understood, if it is valued, because the Great Wall is not only a part of the past, it is part of a continuing story, a story that we are still learning from and still adding to in our own way, seeing the wall differently. After centuries of history, after wars, dynasties, and transformation, there comes a moment when we begin to see the Great Wall differently, not just as something that exists, but as something we interpret, because what we see in the wall often reflects how we choose to understand it. For some, it is still a symbol of power, a structure built to show strength, to define control, to mark the reach of an empire across vast lands, a line that says, "This is where authority stands, and beyond this, something else begins." For others, the wall represents effort, the visible result of human labor on a massive scale, a reminder of what can be achieved when people work together across generations, not for a moment, but for something that continues, something that grows over time, something that becomes greater than any single contribution. And then, there are those who see the wall as a symbol of distance, not just physical distance, but distance between worlds, between ways of life, between perspectives, the settled empire and the moving steppe, the structured and the open, the known and the unknown. The wall becomes the space between these ideas, a place where difference is defined, but also where it can be observed, understood, and perhaps even reconsidered. Because when you stand on the wall, you are not only inside it, you are also looking beyond it. And that creates a unique perspective, one that allows you to see both sides at once, to understand that the wall does not exist in isolation. It exists in relation to what it protects and to what it separates. This perspective changes how we think about it, because the Great Wall is not just about what is inside. It is also about what is outside, about how those two worlds interacted, how they influenced each other, how they changed over time. And this leads to a deeper understanding that the wall is not only a line of division, it is also a point of interaction, a place where ideas meet, where movement is controlled, but not completely stopped, where boundaries exist, but are not absolute. And this idea is important because it reflects something broader, something that extends beyond history. In many ways, the Great Wall becomes a way to think about how people define space, how they create meaning around boundaries, how they decide what belongs and what does not. These decisions are not only physical, they are cultural, political, human, and they continue to exist in the present. But there is another way to see the wall, a quieter way, one that is less about meaning and more about experience. When you walk along the wall, step by step, something changes. The scale becomes real. The distance becomes physical. The effort becomes visible. You begin to feel what it means for something to stretch across such vast land, to follow the shape of mountains, to rise and fall with the terrain. And in that experience, the wall becomes less abstract, less symbolic, and more immediate. You are no longer thinking only about what it represents. You are feeling what it is, the uneven steps, the long paths, the changing views. And through that, you connect with it in a different way. Not through explanation, but through presence. This is something that cannot be fully described, only experienced, and it adds another layer to the wall's identity, because it shows that the Great Wall is not only something to be studied, it is something to be encountered, something that exists in physical space, that can be walked, seen, felt. But even with all these ways of seeing the wall, there is no single answer, no single definition, because the Great Wall does not belong to one meaning. It carries many, and those meanings continue to evolve. As new generations come, they bring new perspectives, new questions, new ways of understanding the past, and the wall becomes part of that process. A structure that remains, while interpretation changes. This is what gives it depth, not just its length, not just its history, but its ability to be seen in different ways, at different times, by different people, and still remain meaningful. Because in the end, the Great Wall is not only about what was built, it is about how we choose to see it, how we connect with it, how we carry its story forward. And that choice belongs to every generation, including ours. But even as we continue to interpret the wall, there is still one final question that remains. Not about how we see it, but about what it ultimately represents when everything else is set aside. What endures after everything the Great Wall has been? A defense, a boundary, a system, a symbol. One question remains. What truly endures? Because time changes everything. Empires rise and fall. Threats appear and disappear. Purposes are created and eventually replaced. But some things continue, not because they remain the same, but because they carry meaning forward. The Great Wall is one of those things. It no longer defends an empire. It no longer stands as the first line against invasion. The world that required it is gone, and yet it remains, not as it once was, but as something that has moved beyond its original role, a structure that has become part of something larger, part of history, part of identity, part of how we understand the past. Because what the wall represents is not limited to the time in which it was built. It represents the idea that people can create something that lasts. That effort, repeated over generations, can become something permanent, something visible, something that continues to exist long after those who built it are gone. This idea is simple, but powerful, because it connects the past to the present. It shows that what is done today can shape what comes tomorrow. That every contribution, no matter how small, can become part of something greater. The Great Wall is not the result of a single decision. It is the result of many, of countless actions, taken over centuries, each one adding to what already existed, each one continuing the process, and this process is what allowed it to endure. But endurance is not only about survival, it is also about meaning, because something can exist and still be forgotten. The Great Wall did not become important only because it survived. It became important because it was remembered, because people continued to see its value, to study it, to visit it, to include it in their understanding of history. And through that, it remained relevant, even as the world changed. Even as its original purpose disappeared, this shows another truth, that what endures is not only what is built, it is what is carried forward through memory, through attention, through the decision to preserve and understand. And this responsibility now belongs to the present, to those who stand on the wall today, to those who learn about it, to those who choose to protect it. Because the future of the wall is no longer in the hands of those who build it. It is in the hands of those who value it. And that changes its story once again, from construction to preservation, from function to meaning, from past to continuity. But even as we reflect on what the wall represents, there is something else to consider, something more subtle. The Great Wall is often seen as something distant, something from another time, another world. But in reality, it reflects something that exists in every era, the human desire to define space, to create boundaries, to protect what matters, and at the same time, to reach beyond those boundaries, to explore, to connect, to understand. The wall exists between these two ideas, protection and connection, separation and interaction. And that balance is something we still navigate today, in different ways, in different forms, but with similar questions. What should be protected? What should be shared? Where should the line be drawn? And what happens when that line changes? The Great Wall does not answer these questions, but it reminds us that they exist, that they have always existed, and that they will continue to exist. Because history is not only about what happened, it is about what continues. The patterns, the choices, the ideas that move from one generation to the next. And in that sense, the Great Wall is not only a structure, it is part of an ongoing story, a story that connects past and present, that reflects human effort, human decisions, human experience. And as long as that story continues, the wall remains part of it, not as something fixed, but as something that continues to hold meaning. And that is what truly endures. Not just the stones, not just the length, but the idea, the effort, the connection across time. Because in the end, the Great Wall is not only about what was built, it is about what continues, and that is something that does not end. After the wall, and then, there is the moment after the stories have been told, after the journeys across centuries, from the first scattered defenses to the longest structure ever built. There is a silence, not an empty silence, but one filled with everything that came before. Because when we step back from the Great Wall, we begin to see something different. Not just the wall itself, but what comes after it. What remains when the purpose fades, when the builders are gone, when the world has moved forward. The wall stands, but life continues beyond it. Cities grow, nations change. New technologies reshape how people connect and protect. The challenges of the past take new forms. And the questions the wall once tried to answer do not disappear. They evolve. Because every era builds its own walls. Not always from stone, but from ideas, from systems, from choices that define boundaries. Who belongs? What is protected? Where limits exist? And just like the Great Wall, These boundaries are never permanent. They change with time, with perspective, with need. This is where the story becomes something else, something that is no longer only about history, but about continuity, the continuation of human decisions, of how we respond to the world around us. The Great Wall becomes a reference point, a reminder of how one generation faced its challenges, how it chose to respond, and how that response shaped everything that followed. But now, the responsibility has moved forward to new generations, to people who no longer build walls across mountains, but who still face questions of protection, connection, and identity. And this is where the story becomes open again, because there is no final answer, no clear ending, only a continuation. The Great Wall does not tell us what to do. It shows us what was done and invites us to think about what comes next. Because history is not a closed story. It is a series of moments, connected by choices. Each generation adding something, each era leaving its mark. And when we look at the Great Wall, we are not only looking at the past, we are looking at a process, a way of responding to the world, a way of building something that lasts. And asking ourselves, what will we build? Not in stone, but in our own time, in our own way. Because the question is no longer, why was the Great Wall built? But what do we choose to build now? What do we protect? What do we connect? What do we carry forward? These are the questions that remain, and they are not answered by history alone. They are answered by those who come after, by those who stand at their own horizon, just as others once did, looking out at what is known and what is not, and deciding whether to stay or to move forward. The Great Wall stands behind us, a line across time, a reminder of what has been done. But the path ahead is still open, and that is where the story continues. What we carry forward, after everything the Great Wall has shown us, its rise, its purpose, its transformation, there is one final layer to its story, not about the wall itself, but about what we carry forward from it, because history does not stay in the past. It moves, quietly, through ideas, through memory, through the way we see the world. And the Great Wall, more than anything, is a reminder of that movement. It began as a response to fear, to uncertainty, to the need for protection. It grew through effort, through generations who added to something they did not begin and would not finish. It transformed over time, from defense to system to symbol to something that belongs to the world. And now, it exists as a story we inherit. But inheritance is not passive. It is a choice, a decision about what to understand, what to preserve, and what to learn. Because when we look at the Great Wall today, we are not only observing it, we are interpreting it. Each person who sees it brings their own perspective. Some see achievement, some see cost, some see strength, some see division. And all of these views exist together, because the wall is not one thing, it is many, and that complexity is part of its value. It teaches us that history is not simple, that every structure, every decision, every moment has more than one meaning, and understanding those meanings is part of moving forward. But there is something else the wall leaves behind, something quieter, but just as important. a sense of continuity. The idea that what we do does not end with us, that actions extend beyond the present, that effort can carry forward into a future we may never see. The Great Wall exists because of that idea, because people continued, because they added, because they believed that what they were building mattered, even if they would never stand at its end. And that idea connects past to present, because it still exists in different forms, in different places, in the way societies build, develop, and plan for what comes next. We may not build walls across mountains, but we still create systems, structures, ideas that shape the future. And like the Great Wall, those things will be judged not only by what they achieve, but by what they leave behind. This is where the story becomes personal, because the Great Wall is not only about a civilization, it is about a pattern, a way of acting in the world, a way of responding to challenge, of creating something that lasts. And that pattern continues through every generation, through every decision, through every moment where something is built, maintained, or transformed. The wall shows us that history is not distant. It is connected, layered, continuous, and that we are part of that continuity, whether we recognize it or not, because even now, we are shaping something that will be seen later, understood differently, interpreted in ways we cannot fully predict. Just as the Great Wall is interpreted today, this is the final layer of its story. Not the structure itself, but the reflection it creates, the way it causes us to think, to question, to consider what matters and what endures. Because in the end, the Great Wall is not only about what was built. It is about what it reveals, about effort, about time, about meaning, and about the connection between past and future. And once we see that, the wall is no longer just something we look at. It becomes something we understand, something we carry, something that continues, not in stone, but in thought. And that is where its story truly lives on, the line that remains in the end. After centuries of construction, change, and meaning, the Great Wall is still there. A line across the land, a presence across time. Not exactly as it once was, but still enough to be seen, still enough to be understood, and perhaps that is what matters most. Because not everything needs to remain complete, to remain important. Some things endure in fragments, in sections, in traces that hint at something larger. The Great Wall exists in that way, parts restored, parts broken, parts lost to time, and yet, together, they still form something whole, something that carries meaning beyond its physical form. When we look at the wall now, we are not only seeing what stands, we are also seeing what has disappeared, what has changed, what has been shaped by time. And this gives it a different kind of value. Not just as a structure, but as a reminder that nothing remains untouched, that everything evolves, that even the greatest achievements are part of a process that continues, but within that change, something remains constant. The idea of the wall, the intention behind it, the effort that created it, those things do not disappear. They move forward. They become part of how we understand the past, part of how we think about the present, part of how we imagine the future. Because the Great Wall is no longer just about China. It is no longer limited to geography. It has become something broader, a symbol recognized across the world, a reference point for what humans can achieve when they commit to something across generations. And that recognition gives it a new kind of life, a life beyond its original purpose, beyond its original place. But even with all this meaning, there is still something simple about it, something direct, a wall, built across land, following the shape of mountains and valleys, rising and falling with the terrain, visible, physical, real. And sometimes, that simplicity is enough because not everything needs to be explained in complex terms. Sometimes, seeing it is enough. Standing near it, walking along it, understanding its scale, feeling its presence, and recognizing that it exists, that it was built, that it endured, that it continues. This experience connects us to something larger, not through words, but through awareness, through the realization that we are part of a world shaped by those who came before, and that what we see today is the result of many moments, many decisions, many lives, all contributing to something that remains. The Great Wall is one of those contributions, a line that was drawn across the land and across time, a line that continues to exist, even as everything around it changes. And maybe that is what defines it. Not its length, not its height, not even its history, but its ability to remain while everything else moves forward. Because in a world that is always changing, there is something powerful about what endures, something that reminds us that not everything disappears, that some things continue in different forms, in different ways, but still present, still meaningful, still part of the story. And the Great Wall is one of those things, a line that remains, not just on the land, but in the way we understand history, in the way we connect with the past, and in the way we think about what lasts. And as long as that line remains, in stone or in memory, its story is not finished. It continues, quietly, endlessly, across time, the quiet continuation. And then, after everything has been built, after everything has been understood, there is what comes next. Not a new wall, not a new empire, but a continuation, a quiet one. Because the story of the Great Wall does not end with its construction, or even with its transformation. It continues, in a different way, not through stone, but through awareness, through the way it lives in memory, in knowledge, in the way people return to it, again and again, to understand something more. Because some structures are not only part of history, they become part of how we think about history, and the Great Wall is one of them. It is used to explain scale, effort, time. It becomes an example, a reference, a way to understand what it means to build something that lasts. And in that role, it continues to exist, not as a defense, but as an idea. But ideas are not static. They evolve. They are shaped by those who encounter them. Each person who learns about the Great Wall sees it differently, interprets it in their own way, adds something to its meaning. And that process never stops, because understanding is not fixed. It grows, changes, deepens over time. The Great Wall becomes part of that process, a point that people return to. Not because it gives one answer, but because it raises many questions. Questions about the past, about human effort, about the relationship between people and the world they build. And these questions extend beyond the wall itself. They connect to broader ideas about how societies respond to challenges, how they organize themselves, how they decide what matters. The wall becomes a way to explore these ideas, a starting point, a structure that invites reflection, and reflection leads to continuation. Because when we think about something, we carry it forward. We include it in how we understand the world, in how we make decisions, in how we interpret other parts of history. And in that sense, the Great Wall is still active, not physically, but intellectually. It continues to influence, to inform, to inspire thought, and this is what gives it a different kind of permanence. Not just as a structure that survives, but as a concept that continues. Because even if every stone were to disappear, the idea would remain. The story would remain. The meaning would remain. Carried through memory, through knowledge, through the decision to remember. And that is something no structure can guarantee on its own. It depends on people, on attention, on the willingness to keep a story alive. The Great Wall has that. It has been carried forward, across centuries, across changes, across different ways of understanding the world, and it continues to be carried, quietly, without force, without urgency, simply by existing and by being recognized. And maybe that is where its final meaning begins to appear. Not in what it was built to do, but in what it allows us to think about, to consider, to question. Because not all endings are clear. Some become transitions, points where one story becomes part of another. The Great Wall is one of those points, a place where the past meets the present, where history becomes reflection, where structure becomes idea, and where the story does not stop, but changes form and continues in ways that are less visible, but just as real. The final line. And now, after everything that has been built, changed, and understood, we return to the wall. Not as it was in the beginning, not as it was in its strongest form, but as it stands today, a line across the land and across time. Because in the end, the Great Wall is not just a structure. It is a journey that began with fear, grew through effort, and transformed through meaning. It was built to protect, to define, to create a boundary between worlds. But over time, it became something more, a reflection of human ambition, of persistence, of the ability to continue, even when the end is not visible. Stone by stone, generation after generation, the wall took shape, not through one moment, but through many. Not through one vision, but through many. And that is what gives it its power. Because the Great Wall is not the achievement of one ruler or one dynasty. It is the result of continuation, of people who added to something they inherited and left it for those who would come after. And that idea is what remains, not just in the wall, but in everything it represents. Because every generation builds something that extends beyond its own time, something that becomes part of a larger story. And the Great Wall is one of the clearest examples of that process. But there is also something else, something quieter, because when we stand before the wall or walk along it, we are not only seeing history, we are standing within it, within the effort, within the decisions, within the moments that shaped it. And in that experience, the distance between past and present disappears. The wall becomes immediate, real, something that exists not only in time, but in space, something we can see, touch, understand. And yet, even with all that understanding, there is still something beyond it, something that cannot be fully explained. Because the Great Wall is not only about what we know, it is also about what we feel, the sense of scale, the sense of time, the awareness that this structure existed long before us and will likely exist long after. And that awareness changes perspective. It reminds us that we are part of something larger, a longer story, one that continues, just as the wall continues, not unchanged, but still present, still meaningful, still connected to everything that came before and everything that comes after. And that is where the story reaches its final point, not an ending, but a realization that the Great Wall is not only a line built across China, it is a line built across time, connecting effort to outcome, past to present, and present to future. Because what began as a response to fear became a symbol of endurance, and what was once a boundary became a connection. And now, it stands as something that belongs not only to one place, but to the story of humanity itself. And as we step away from it, as we return to our own time, one thing remains clear. The wall still stands. And as long as it does, so does the story. The story not only of what was built, but of what continues. And that is the final line.